Hello, everybody. Welcome back to conversation number 112. Gosh, we've been here for a while, y'all. Today, we're going to be talking 5 stories to rewire your statistical intuition, which we all need. But before we start, like always, let's thank our sponsors. First, Conductrix. They've been with us from the very, very beginning. Thank you, Matt, Nate, Ezekiel, Ashley, Dominica, and the entire team at Conductrix so much for supporting the TLC. And we'd like to thank our TLC newsletter sponsors, starting with Conductrix, but also Growthbook and Ask Why. Thank you so much for providing thought leadership to the community. And I want to add a new sponsor this month. Amplitude has joined us. They are going to be hosting some live events like the TLC Happy Hour, StatSig, and Amplitude on August 27th in Chicago. So if you're in the greater Chicago area, please join us. And I will pop over here to kind of show y'all about that. We can zoom a lot on that. That's fun. If you are on the TLC website, you can click on events and see about all our upcoming events. Like I said, we have the TLC Happy Hour in Chicago, August 27th. It's at the Publicis Sapient building. They're donating the space, which is amazing. And Amplitude is even covering food, drinks, and parking. So there is no cost for you to go if you're in the area. Please come. We're going to have a great time. And then right below that, you can subscribe to the events calendar. You see all the great stuff. So today we're talking 5 stories to rewire your statistical intuition. August 14th, we're bridging the great disconnect with all the challenges and potentials. Then we have the happy hour. And then Iqbal is joining us for a 2-part. First session is talking about making the case for small models over big models for building things with AI. And then we will invite the folks that are interested in a RSVP required workshop where he will actually, interactively teach folks over a 90-minute workshop on Wednesday, September 16th, how to build with small models. So if you can't attend the big tech model delusion in the case for small models on September 11th, watch the recording and then register for the workshop. And there will be another talk added for October with Will Critchlow soon. But if you keep scrolling, you'll see Experimentation Island is now Optimizers Conference. And if you didn't know that, where have you been? But today, right now, is the last day for the Flying Blind tickets. Those are the ones that start at $13.95. You can go to the website at optimizersconference.com, read about the experience, the theme, the attendees. If you click on speakers, you're only going to see speakers from the last 2 years. Until tomorrow. Tomorrow, we'll announce our first 2 speakers, so that's exciting. And if you click on tickets, you'll see the Flying Blind tickets are today's last day. Starting tomorrow, we'll switch to the super early bird pricing. So you definitely want, if you're planning to attend, try to get your ticket today. And last but not least, check out this venue. We're going to be at Chaminade Resort in Santa Monica, and it is beautiful. So I highly, highly encourage anybody that has a potential to attend to check out all of this and let me know if you have any questions. Heading back over to our thing, I still have to thank Convert for the sponsoring the Conversations channel. It's a way where you can ask and answer questions in the TLC, get to know your peers and win prizes, and get your content potentially published by Convert. So highly encourage folks to check that out. And last, Blazing Growth. Thank you, Eddie Aguilar, for your support of the community. Now, let me close these because they're in our way. And let's dive into our introductions of our friend here. Why won't it? There we go. Whew, scary. Thought for a second I didn't have my my page. So if you don't know Ishan yet, you're in for a treat. He's one of the few people working exclusively on the statistics of experimentation. He built the statistics engine at VWO and recently trained the data product and marketing teams at The Economist. And in 2026, which is how I found out about him, he won the Best in Test Award for Best Educational Content. In 2025, he founded Thinking Bell with the goal of helping experimentation teams around the world build stronger intuition for statistics, which is sorely needed. So really glad you're working on that. And through his writing, free weekly talks, consulting, and his 20-hour statistics boot camp, he's making a topic that many find intimidating a whole lot more approachable, which is why we invited him here today. So today's session is one that I have been looking forward to because statistics is one of those areas where small misunderstandings, they linger and they can lead to really big mistakes. So he has a gift for explaining the why behind the math in a way that is both practical and immediately useful, and I hope you all enjoy it. So with that, let me pass the screen to you.
Thank you. Thanks for that wonderful introduction, Kelly. I'm so glad to be speaking for this community, and I'm so glad for this opportunity to yes, to be explaining statistics to you guys. I've enjoyed explaining statistics back since the days at VWO, and very few people, I think, realize the value of statistics in experimentation. And that's why anytime I get listeners to this kind of things, I'm just very, very happy. So thanks again to the TLC community and to everyone who has joined the call to listen about these 5 stories to rewire your statistical intuition. So I want to share a bit about this talk before I start. I've given a fair bunch of talks as part of Thinking Bell and these weekly stat talks that I do. This talk is something I've prepared brand new for this TLC talk because over the past year, after teaching a lot of people, and I think teaching does this to you, where by teaching you actually realize the concepts, and when people ask you questions, the larger picture gets clarified in your mind. So these ideas have sort of fermented in my mind and brewed in my mind over these past 21 months that I've been running Thinking Bell. And what I realized was that everything that I'm teaching, it sort of boils down to some fundamentals about statistics. And I feel that if these fundamentals are communicated well, then everything that applies to experimentation sort of flows from here. So these, I've really tried to sort of get down to why statistics is the way it is and why you need to think about experiments in a different way with an understanding of uncertainty and statistical gaps on how you see data and what you see data for. So I'm getting started. This is 5 stories to rewire your statistical intuition. Please feel free to raise your hands if you have any comments or any discussion that you want to raise in between. I want to start with one story. So this is a story from a skeptic called Diagorus, and he was taken to a temple and he was shown the paintings of a lot of sailors who prayed and they survived a shipwreck essentially. So because they prayed, so what the priest was trying to tell him that look, this is the evidence that people who prayed actually survived the shipwreck. So this story comes from long back, and Diagorus, being the skeptic that he was, he asked this one question. And the question he asked was, where are the paintings of those who prayed but still did not survive? I think that is one of the deepest and one of the most important things about data and about statistics, that we look at data from the vantage point of where we are standing. It's not like the entire data set is always available to us. We are always, it's just the fundamental property that we are limited by time and space, so that we get to see some things and we don't get to see some things because they do not survive the shipwreck in one way. So the things that we do not see, essentially, they are often very decisive in what conclusions that we are drawing from data. So, what is this talk going to be about before we move forward? I am not going into the specifics of statistical significance or how statistics is calculated and stuff. I want to talk about the fundamental problems with evidence that we see in the world, and how does that determine the uncertainty that we perceive in our decisions and in the things that we try out in the world. And with each story, I want to share one thing that you should think about in your A/B tests, and that will essentially guide you towards thinking broadly about the uncertainty that lives in your decisions with A/B tests. So, the thing about data is that I think at any given point of time, you can only look at some bit of data that you can throw light upon from your vantage point. So, and this something in statistics, this comes up as sampling data. So, in statistics, what we believe is that there is um, there is theoretically an average which includes all the data points possible in the world. So, if you are introducing a feature, the average conversion rate would really include everyone in the future and in the past who can technically become part of your website and use that feature. But you do not have the option to look at that entire data set. You only have the option to look at a one sample from that entire larger data set. And that sample also depends where you are standing in time and where you are standing in space. So, where are you collecting visitors from? So, essentially, it's like a person throwing a torch on a wall and only one bit of the wall that he can see. What we really expect is we really expect that the sample that we are seeing is closely resembling to everything that we are not seeing in the world. So we expect that the sample that we are seeing and the sample that we are not seeing are basically uniform, independently and randomly distributed. In that case, the sample that we actually see will be a very good representation of the actual world that we are trying to going to deploy our feature upon, and the real reality that we are sending out our feature into. But a lot of times, data is not like that. A lot of times reality is essentially not uniformly distributed because people themselves sort them out into various uh, places to be in, and sometimes things are different across time, things are correlated across time. So if you think about it, if the real underlying reality is something like this, and imagine the blues to be the point that the feature is not working, for example, and the reds is the indication that your feature is working probably. So it is entirely possible that the sample that you collect does not do justice to the reality that is underlying, that is seen, essentially. I think this is one of the most important ideas in statistics when it comes to A/B testing, because a lot of times I see that people are filtering data. It depends where you are filtering data upon. Some kinds of filterings are reliable. Some kinds of filterings are not reliable. One very good example that I would want to share practically here is that suppose you are wanting to ask, that is queries per month, a good metric to measure the quality of a search engine. Uh, it depends on where the search engine is placed. So if you think about for Google, queries per month is a very good metric to measure improvements in a search engine. For Netflix, queries per month is not a good metric because that means that your recommendation engine on the homepage is not very working very well. That's why your queries per session are increasing. So what I want to see is that a lot of times I've realized that this question of what we are not able to see inside our tests, it actually dictates how your test should be, which metric should you be picking, and what statistical methods you should be applying, and how confident you are, what accuracy and MD and all those things you should place. So it determines a lot of the design of the experiment that you want to make. One question that comes up is what about randomization? And randomization is a very, very beautiful thing. But it does one thing, it does not do another. So in experimentation, what we do is we create a control group in all forms of experimentation, not just A/B testing, even the experimentation that has existed prior to these A/B tests. We try to create a control group which does not get the treatment that we want to give, and we have a treatment group where we actually apply the treatment that we want to give. And this randomization is a very powerful technique. Why? Because it takes your entire sample set and it essentially randomly puts people into the control group and the treatment group such that the control group and the treatment group is actually same in all other regards except for the treatment. So if you think in terms of this light that we are throwing onto the wall, if we were to just blatantly divide it in half, that we decide that 7 days will show the control and 7 days will show the variation. The problem is that it might be that a lot of these red individuals who are more likely to respond in the treatment, they might land in one group, and a lot of these blue individuals might land in another group. So that is why actually we randomize in an A/B test, and randomization forms a very core crux of why A/B tests are reliable. But I want to tell this that there are two kinds of biases. Randomization ensures that there is no internal bias between the control group and the variation group. But randomization cannot ensure that if the external generalizability of the result is there or not. So if I am running a test on an e-commerce website on new sweaters and I run it on some in summers, then my test results might not apply in winters. So that's something that you need to think and understand, that what you are essentially missing out in the larger data set. And that's how you'll be able to decide and understand whether your test design is valid for the problem, for the answer that you are seeking or not. So this is the first thing that I wanted to share. If anyone wants to add comments, ask any questions before I move to story two. Great. I'll move forward. This I've kept larger ideas. I have not delved deep into it because I want to give the flavor of how I have understood statistics over these many years in experimentation. So coming to story two, which is related to what I just talked about in story one. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. This is one of those ideas that really, they define a lot of limitations of science. And this is not just A/B testing. This is just fundamentally how science works. So if we talk about how knowledge and how the science of knowledge has developed, so we can go back to the times of Renaissance, when before which people used to believe that all truth comes from a holy book, or all truth has been derived from some written book that has been given to us. The first movement that happened in that regard was empiricism. Empiricism was when people said that we won't believe that truth comes from a book. We'll first start by believing that that truth comes from what we observe in the world. And empiricism later developed to inductivism. And inductivism said that the more we are able to see the repetition of one truth in different domains, we can derive a meta level truth from what we are observing, and that will be more likely to be true across domains. Finally, this very interesting thing comes up, and which I want to share here, is David Hume talked about negative empiricism. He says that we are looking at the evidence, but we are not looking at the evidence that we are not seeing in the world. And he coined this story about the turkey, which is slightly dark, but it is still very representative of the idea. He says that a turkey that has been raised to be cooked on Thanksgiving for 1,000 days, the turkey is getting the evidence that her caretaker is a good person who cares about her survival. He gives her food, so the turkey is regularly becoming comfortable and comfortable and comfortable until Thanksgiving Day arrives. And that one evidence point that comes on Thanksgiving is just against everything that the turkey has seen for the first 1,000 days, because her caretaker was supposed to be a good person. And suddenly on Thanksgiving Day, the turkey realized that this doesn't fit in anything that she has seen up till now. Whereas if you think from the perspective of the caretaker, actually, he was always aware that this 1,001th day is going to come. So there was nothing surprising about Thanksgiving Day for the caretaker, whereas it was very surprising for the turkey. So this brings us to the point that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And this is very fundamental to a lot of our A/B tests, that we can be sure if we see evidence for something, but we cannot really be sure if we do not see evidence. So going back to our analogy of the wall, it is entirely possible that you are looking at an area where you are not likely to find evidence anyways. So in your A/B test, if you do not find a winner, you cannot say that the effect is not working or the change is not working. There are many things that are possible. One thing that is very much possible is that your sample size was not enough to detect something that is statistically significant. So that happens all the time if you're not running properly powered experiments. The other thing that is possible is maybe you ran the experiment on the wrong metric. Maybe the metric itself was not sensitive enough to detect the change that you have made. Maybe a few months down the line, that metric will show a change. Maybe not right now. And it is also possible that maybe a large part of your audience is actually not seeing the change that you have made. So, suppose that Netflix tries out a new recommendation engine for its audience, and say for 90% of the audience, the new recommendation engine does not change the recommendations that show up in the first four thumbnails. So, technically, the impact of the new recommendation engine is not even observable for 90% of the audience. And for the 10% that it is observable, maybe the impact is strong, but it has just been diluted by those 90% which are not seeing the change. So this is a very fundamental idea that you can never conclude from an A/B test that a change is not working. If a change is not working, you need to go back to the basics and you need to, maybe that experiment was not worth running. A lot of times, the advice that I give to people is that do not essentially run an experiment that is unlikely to yield any insight. Maybe you can invest visitors on something else that is more likely to yield insights. So, this is very interesting. Why? Because I've also started to realize that scientific thinking itself is based on these two fundamentals and two ideas. I feel this is a fundamental asymmetry in experimentation. You cannot conclude anything if you fail to find evidence. But if you see something surprising, there is got to be an explanation. And I think if you think scientifically, then a lot of times you need to be asking if I'm drawing conclusions or if I'm thinking about a thought, what evidence do I have? If I do not have the evidence, then it can mean a thousand things. Suppose I write a cold email to someone and then I start concluding that maybe they do not like me. That's why they do not have not replied. But I do not have evidence. It can be anything. It can be that they did not see the email. It can be that they were busy with something else. I think one part of scientific thinking is that you do not conclude anything if you fail to find evidence. You need to be okay saying, I don't know, it can be a thousand things. The other part of scientific thinking, I feel, is that if you see something surprising, there has to be an explanation. And I sometimes think about these four people who predicted the stock market crash of 2008, or the housing market crash of 2008. And I wonder whether they were just very confident people that they had this trust in their gut, or were they just someone who did not believe that they cannot be wrong, that they can be wrong. But now I realize that no, they would probably people who would not believe in something that they don't see evidence for. But the moment you see something surprising cannot exist in the world without any reason. There needs to be an explanation for it. And I think these two contradicting truths of you being able to say that you don't know when you don't have evidence, and the other thing that when you see evidence, then there has to be an explanation. Together, they create the fundamental scientific attitude with which I think we need to move forward in experimentation. Any questions, anything that anyone wants to ask? Great, thank you. I'll move forward then. This third idea, I think, is one that is repeatedly in this Thinking Well bootcamp. I'm realizing that this is underappreciated and it really, really matters in real life when you go down to making decisions from your A/B tests. So there has been a lot of discussion, a lot of thought around how accurate the results of an A/B test are. We know that a lot of times, even winners that we deploy do not turn out to be winners. I think I think decision making can never be very, very accurate. A lot of people are wrong a lot of times. But when you make decisions, there are two components, not just one. You do not get the payoff for just being accurate on the bet that you have made. You get a payoff because every side of the decision that you make has some costs associated to it. So I would like to share these two examples, which really show you two different sides of the spectrum. One is, say someone goes for a test for cancer, and the false positive here is that they are detected positive, but they do not actually have cancer. The false negative here is that they failed that the test fails to detect any cancer cells, but they actually had cancers. So if I realize that there are two kinds of errors I can make. One is the false positive and one is the false negative. But testing for cancer, the false negative is vastly more costly than the false positive. If someone walks out of a clinic and thinks they do not have cancer where they actually did, it's much more costly than someone who walks out of the clinic thinking they have cancer and they did not actually have cancer, because in the process of getting treated and tested further, they'll finally be able to detect that they do not have cancer. So the false negative is very costly in one case. But in another case, if you think, if there is a jury trial and you have to convict someone for a crime that has been committed, convicting an innocent is much more costly than letting a guilty person walk free out of that court. So the false positive is much more costly than the false negative in the second case. So I think a lot of situations in real life, when you see, you realize that one of these costs of false negatives and false positives is vastly more costly than the other. And that really determines the design of the test that you really need to make. So what I've realized is that sometimes there are these tests which are incremental enhancements tests on one end. Like all tests are a combination of these. There are no big trade-offs that you are making on these tests. Suppose you are making copy changes on your product regularly to hit the right audience so that they listen, they are able to relate to your product. So missing out on something that works is much more costly. But deploying something that does not work, assuming that it is not total gibberish, is not that costly, essentially, in the case of these incremental enhancements. So you need to apply a entirely different statistical design if the false negative is costly. You would probably want to use sequential testing. You would probably want to have other methods like non-inferiority testing. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, there are these tests where you are making strategic trade-offs, where there are inherent costs to deploying the change that you have made. So suppose, for example, if an e-commerce company is wants to invest in an infrastructure for one-day delivery in hopes to beat competition, it is a very costly decision. They do not want to deploy a false positive in that case. They only want to go forward with implementing that infrastructure change if they are sure that it is actually going to help them increase conversion rates and whatever the target metric is. In those cases, the statistical design changes entirely. You think about lesser false positive rates, you think about one for only correction, you think about other things. But what I've realized is that a lot of times we are going by just vanilla statistical design, statistical defaults. Whereas this is one question that I've started to ask a lot of people in a lot of experiments, that which of these two sides is more costly? Is the false negative more costly or the false positive more costly? Because that will change the entire decision making strategy from that experiment that you have. And usually, a lot of times, one of these is costlier than the other. Anyone wants to share something? Or
I'll
I
just
can share a few more. Yes, please,
just so
Kelly.
you know, there's people commenting in the chat along the way, but we'll review some of them if anybody has questions at the end. So no.
Oh, sounds great. Interesting. Thank you. Great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. Yes, I think we can take up the questions towards the end. So I think this is one of the very crucial questions, and it just decides how long you run experiments, what configuration you want to make, whether you want to keep it one-sided, two-sided. All these things flow down from here, and yeah, this question keeps coming up again and again. Coming to the fourth story that I want to share, and I really love this one. A person who is 6 feet tall in height is crossing a jungle. He comes across a river. A board says that average depth of the river is 4 feet. Should he cross the river or not? Anyone wants to take a guess?
I would say
Kelly
no,
says,
because the law of averages.
yes, yes. I think what gets missed out, and especially people who are not used to thinking about averages and statistics is that averages mean a lot when the spread of data is small. So average represents the central tendency of data. But when there is a very high variance in data, when the spread of data is very wide, then averages lose their meaning. So a river that is 4 feet deep on average can be very deep at some places and can be very shallow at some places. That will make for 4 feet deep. And that is something that is true for your conversion rates as well, and even uplifts as well. When you are looking at averages on your website, they are just representative of the central tendency, but they do hide a lot of underlying things. And that's why I think post test analysis is very, very important. And what I want to share is like, for instance, these continuous metrics often have this outlier problem. And if it is entirely possible that you are looking at an average, but there are so many outliers in your data that your averages do not mean a lot. And then it raises the question that maybe, say, if you have a donation website and maybe you have written a very emotionally compelling copy on your page, and suddenly you see that the variation is working, maybe that compelling copy is actually improving the outliers but not the larger mass. Maybe someone with very big pockets was just so inspired by the copy that you have written that they left such a large donation that your averages have moved up. All these things get hidden down in the averages, and I think it's a very, very important thing, that when you look at averages you need to think about what is the spread of the underlying data, and how is the underlying data really distributed, that can explain this average. Maybe it supports your conclusions, maybe it does not. One thing that I share is I think post segmentation is very interesting. I always, when I get a chance, I um, I try to dissect my data based on various dimensions, and how I like to think about it. I think like to think about your data as a Rubik's cube, maybe, and that cube has multiple dimensions to it. So maybe one dimension is returning versus new visitors. Another dimension is the country that they are coming from. Another dimension is the device type they are coming from. So essentially, it's the same way to divide your data set um, into various blocks, but every side is showing you some different dimension. Two very interesting problems that I've realized that can sometimes exist in data and sometimes not is, one is the high variance problem. If you tend to segment your data into into some dimension, and you see widely fluctuating uplifts on both sides. So there are negative uplifts also, there are positive uplifts also. It is very likely that your metric has a high variance that has not been resolved. So a few outliers here, a few outliers there are causing some group to have a positive uplift and some group to have a negative uplift. It is entirely possible that a data like this gives you a statistically significant uplift just because there was a few outliers on one side, but that uplift will not be reliable. I generally try to see that if can I see some reliable patterns on two, three independent segments, and only then I try to conclude that okay, the uplift is really, really working. Another side of the problem is that maybe it is entirely possible that your entire uplift or the reduction is heavy lifted by just one segment and all other segments are sort of mellow or lukewarm essentially. So suppose if your test has an SRM or an AA test has given a winner, then the problem most likely can be narrowed down to one segment and all other segments are essentially not affected. So sometimes this unusual segment problem might also make your average uplift look like it has become significant, whereas it won't be. So this is just some examples. I do not explicitly say that all post-segmentation insights are reliable. Post-segmentation is very much like the rule that we talked about. It is entirely possible that you do not find strong evidence for anything. But when you do find evidence that is very surprising, it generally means that there is something worth digging down to. So the larger point of the stories is that averages need to be taken with a pinch of salt. You cannot just blindly accept averages. You need to do the detective work after an experiment has run its course. Any questions, any thoughts? Great. Then I'll move to story five, which is the one that is the most complex and most unliked by most people who join my class. But this is something that is very counterintuitive to a lot of people. But I want to share a case here. Suppose there is an experimenter and the 80% of ideas that they generate are bogus. They do not have a true uplift. 20% of ideas that they generate are good ideas. They really do have an uplift. They truly give an uplift. Now, the statistical machinery that you are using, which is generally all A/B tests have this error rate. The false positive rate, which is the chance that you get a winner from a bogus idea, is 5%. So if the idea is really bogus, the chance that you'll still get a winner is 5%. If the idea is really good, if it really has an uplift, the chance that you'll get a winner is 80%. My question is, what is the chance that a declared winner is bogus? Generally we tend to think that if this number is small, which is the chance that a bogus idea declares a winner, which is 5%, then we tend to believe that a winner being bogus will also be small, which is not the case. And that is very, very surprising to people. Because if you think about it, when you are running an experiment and you get a winner and you are now taking a decision whether to deploy it or not, the chance that when you deploy it, will the winner replicate in production or not, is not the false positive rate. It is the false positive risk. It is the chance that a winner turns out to be bogus. In this case, which is still a lot of people who have run experiments know that a 20% good idea rate is also fairly high. In this case, it comes out to be 20%. Why? I'll explain. Is in this case, why it comes out to be 20% is that you essentially get 16 winners from this good idea route. So if you had 100 experiments, 20 were good ideas. Out of those, 16 came out to be winners, which were true winners. And if 80 were bad ideas, out of these, 4 came out to be winners, which means that you in total you got 20 winners, out of which 4 were bogus. So the chance that you deploy a winner and it turns out to be bogus is 20%. And this is also on the positive side of things. A lot of times, because this ratio between good idea and bad idea is even lower, so you have even lesser, like maybe 8 to 10% of ideas that are good for a lot of companies that have reached maturity, and a lot of companies like Amazon and Google who run a lot of experiments. When this number goes down, this number goes even up, even more up. So this is called the false positive risk, the false discovery rate. I think this makes for a very, very important point that I've been reiterating again and again for people. Decisions are wrong a lot of times, more than you expect by setting the false positive rate to be 5%. Uh, I think the important portion here is that uh, there is this, I call this number the prior. Essentially, this is unknowable because you can never know how many good ideas you are running and how many bad ideas you are running. You can only guess this number. And this is also known as the base rate of the phenomena. So if you are trying to detect a disease that happens to very few people in the population, then the chance that a person who has tested positive is diseased actually goes down because the disease itself has a very low base rate. Showing you a bit more on base rate in 2 minutes, but firstly, I want to say that these two are often we confuse between these two directions of probability intuitively. So if you think about the story that we started with, that the diarist who went to a temple and he saw the paintings of people who prayed and they survived, what he was looking at was the probability that a person who survived had actually prayed. But what he was being told was the probability that someone who prayed actually survives. So we tend to confuse repeatedly again and again in real life that we tend to think that that the probability that prayed given survivor, that someone who survived actually prayed is equivalent to, is somewhere close to someone who survived because they prayed. So this is a confusion we repeatedly do when we are drawing inferences from data. For instance, if someone has a PhD, what is the chance that they'll get a Nobel Prize? If you reverse it, someone who got a Nobel Prize, what is the chance that they actually had a PhD? These two numbers can be widely, widely different. So once you change the direction of these events, we intuitively think that they are the same, but they are not. I think this is one of the biggest confusions of statistics. This is also why p-values are so hard to interpret. This is also why confidence intervals have such complicated definition. Once you get it, you start seeing statistics in a different light. Uh, I would want to show visually why this happens. There is something called base rate of a phenomena. Any phenomena in general population sometimes occurs with a higher probability and sometimes occurs with a lower probability. Any test that you run to detect that phenomena, you can never control the base rates. You can only control the mechanics of that test, how powerful that test is, what is the false positive rate of that test. But this chance that the test declares a winner is actually a winner or not depends on two things. One is these base rates and the evidence that you gather from the test. So if we go back to that analogy from the wall, I want to show you two cases. One where the base rates are high. So just imagine that the red dots are the ones that are truly good ideas. The blue dots are the ones that are truly bad ideas. If these two are comparable, and this highlighted area is the one that we are calling out to be winners. So what we see here is that if reds and blues are 50-50 in ratio, then even in this winner, in those ideas that we call winners, there is a very high chance that reds dominate and blues are a few. But if reds become rarer, which is for a lot of radical ideas, which is for a lot of ideas that do not have uh, domain backing or scientific backing, new ideas that you are testing out, uh, the reds are much more fewer. So the truly good ideas are much more fewer, and the truly bad ideas are much more. So even if you are calling out a winner in the same ratio, you realize that you are calling a lot more bad ideas as winners and a lot less good ideas as winners. So what I'm trying to say here is that there are limitations to stats. There are limitations to statistical tests. They cannot control these base rates of the phenomena that are there. These base rates come from your prior knowledge. The operative idea is that if you doubt, if you think the idea that you are testing, winning it is really surprising, then you should double down. Maybe you should demand that you'll not accept a winner till you reach 99% significance. And it also means that you should not just randomly throw ideas on the wall and run experiments. I generally suggest that when you are running experiments, you should think deeply about why it should be making a change. It should not be just that you're just randomly testing out as many ideas as possible. So it also, I'm not going into the details, but it also connects very deeply to the frequentist and Bayesian school of thought, because I think frequentists purely look at the evidence that is available from data, and Bayesians include the prior belief, which is inclusive of the base rates, and they merge them with the evidence to give an answer to this backward question that what is the chance that a winner is bogus or not. Just one last thing after which I'm wrapping up. uh, this joke I found in a philosophy book and I really liked it. And I've spent many years on the frequentist versus Bayesian debate. I have done a lot of research on the frequentist school, also on the Bayesian school, also. Finally, I've come to the conclusion that I would want to calculate frequentist probabilities, but I would want to think Bayesian. I think as humans, we think Bayesian. So this joke is that an empiricist and his wife are on a drive in the countryside, and they come across some sheep, and the wife says that, oh, look, the sheep have been shorn. The empiricist smiles and says, yes, but on this side, because the empiricist can only see the sheep from one side, he cannot the other side of see the other side of the sheep. So the empiricist is very careful. He does not want to draw conclusions about what he cannot see. Whereas the wife here, I think, is thinking from a Bayesian way. Why? Because she understands that the base rates or the priors of sheep being shorn only on one side are pretty low, because sheep, when they are shorn on both sides. So she is bringing in her prior mental model into place, then merging the evidence with that, and then concluding that the sheep have been shorn on both sides. This, I think, as a last point, it also takes us to Immanuel Kant. I think Immanuel Kant derived this idea that if we just look at sensory information that we receive from our eyes and our nose and our senses, then these sensory informations are just broken pieces of evidence that we derive from the world. But what helps you stitch those different sensory information is a prior model that we keep in our mind. So if I'm looking at my laptop and I look at my laptop from this angle and from this angle, for my senses, it is just two different pictures that I'm seeing. But there is internally, I have a model in my mind that combines these two pictures and tells me that I'm looking at the same laptop from two different points. So I personally think that we think fundamentally in a Bayesian way. That is why I always motivate companies that when you are running experiments, you should have a causal model on why something works and why something does not work. And then when you see evidence, you should merge it with your underlying causal graph of how you think your website is working, how you think engagement and all those things are working. With that, I would like to wrap up. This was more of a abstract ideas in statistics meant to change the way that you think. I generally teach the things that I teach are mostly derived from here, but I try to extend these ideas, apply those to fundamental concrete concepts that you can use in daily life experimentation. So thank you all for listening to me. Thank you all for your patience. I'm very open to all questions and all comments now. Thank you.
First of all, I want to say it was lovely to see news stories applied to things that, I've been teaching and coaching for years, and now I have a new storybook to add. That's awesome. So often you see people like survivorship bias, it's the plane. Everybody uses the plane analogy. So I really, really liked the prayer versus drowning. It's great, great job. Fantastic. Some of the things that some folks have mentioned over here, I want to start with Florent's last comment, if that's okay, Florent. Uh,
Yes, yes.
he pointed out right after you mentioned this that when a test looks like 75% likely to be a success, it's really just a toss up. Florent, would you be willing to hop on and tie that to what we were talking about?
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you see me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. No. So, I mean, basically, what happened is that I had started with a very naive variation framework of just like assume everything is as like this. And you're like, oh, okay, this test looks like really good. It's like the success rate is much higher in the treatment group than in the control group. But then when we were like, okay, actually, only 30% of cases we're seeing in the past with the treatment was a winner. So then based on that, you kind of have to consider, well, is that 75% face value, how much of that is driven by, well, it's probably like lucky. It's like, oh, it got like the lucky side of the draw, but it's not the true value. And that was a bit of a hard sell to the business side of it. Like, well, the lift is giant. And I'm like, yeah, well, if the lift is giant, then it's probably not true. And that was a good conversation. That was not an easy or fun conversation.
So in other
Thank
words, you're seeing because you're seeing a high false discovery rate, and when you apply that to your historical wins, especially the big wins, it's hard to tell them, yeah, that big lift you saw was probably a false positive, a false
Yeah,
detection.
because the thing is that if you imagine like one way of thinking about it is like you're imagining that all AG tests you're drawing from an urn of potential lift, and it's like, well, if two out of three times we get a number that is negative or very small out of that urn, and then we get a huge number. Like, yeah, that was probably not the true number. One of the things I say is that assuming that you're going to program your experimentation program is going to be very successful means assuming that yourself from 1 year ago was an idiot because otherwise, like all the things would have been found already, and like no, all the low-hanging fruit were caught. So like if you find big lift, it's probably not the low-hanging fruit, and a flounder it's probably just randomness.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree. And I also want to say that a lot of even Bayesian engines cannot confidently tell that what is the chance for the variation to be better than control. Without the priors, it falls down to exactly the p-values. So your false positive risk is still very high. even with Bayesian engines. So yeah.
Have you seen, Ishan, have you seen Bayesian engine? So I had a client once that built their own that used the historical A/B test record to update their priors for every test before they launched it, and then continuously update. So their priors were a lot more solid because they actually attached their analytics data and their historical test data into their Bayesians. Um, Priors. But what I haven't seen is anybody who has done something like that and evaluated the prior predictions against a frequentist, error control to see, because like you just said, depending on how informed the priors are, they probably just come out to the same p-values. But have you actually seen somebody? Well, I mean, we're testers. Have you seen somebody test that?
So I would firstly share two things here. One is that there's this common conception in the Bayesian world that you need priors to define your conversion rates, which I think is a bad idea because it still leaves the
Uninformed
uplift.
priors work, but then it's no different than frequentist, right?
Yeah. Then it's exactly the same. I've run those simulations. I think the first thing is that rather than defining priors on your conversion rates of the baseline, you need to have priors on the uplift of whether that idea will work or not. Because conversion rates having priors still leaves the variation to be anywhere away. So I think what matters is the priors of the uplift, not.
Kelly,
Yes.
one challenge I ran into, I tried to do some very Rube Goldberg manual version of that. But one problem is like historical data is not truthful. I'm like, when I calculate it, like, okay, I'm gonna, for historical data, I'm gonna look at how often the I'm gonna look at all the observed list value as my baseline, but those observed list value had noise themselves. And so basically, I'm like, okay, well, this is the observed list. Then from that, I infer my
So
expected
it's the
underlying
same
parameter.
problems we all have with AI. You're feeding slop in and you're getting slop out.
Sloppy.
So
Yeah, it's like yeah, you don't know, like, I mean, because the problem is, so like, you're like, I look at the historical data, then I estimate the underlying parameter from the historical data, then based on that parameter, I look back to my historical data and like, how many of them were actually false positive, and like, it's gonna converge to something, but there's still a lot that goes into that sausage, because it's like the problem my wife had in fraud is like, we just don't know what was really fraud and what was not really fraud in what we called fraud in the past. And so at the end, we're kind of often just going into circles with calling fraud what we called fraud in the past.
absolutely. Great
Yes.
example. Hey, y'all, we have 1 minute, and I want to, first of all, say see you soon, Florent, in Chicago, and remind everybody else today's your last day to get your Optimizers Conference Flying Blind ticket. That's the lowest price we will have, and it ends today, and that's before we announce our first speakers. We'll announce first two speakers tomorrow. Very exciting. So get your tickets. And if you're in the Chicagoland area, come see us August 27th. Registration by end of day, August 25th. Thank you, Ishan. This was amazing. I will get the recording up it'll take about an hour to get it up, and then I'll share it on the recordings channel and the TLC calls channel. And thanks, everybody. I hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Kelly, and thanks everyone for attending. I will look forward to the recording. Thank you.
All right. Bye, all.